Greetings, gentle viewers. Today, I thought we could talk about how science becomes scientism, because all data must be interpreted in order to form a conclusion. And this interpretation is influenced by our biases, our prejudices, our expectations, and the models that we believe are true. All of these factors come to bear on how we make sense of the data that we collect, and that forms the conclusions that we then sometimes mistake for truth. I thought I could tell you a story that exemplifies how this comes about, how this problem creeps in to science, and if we're not vigilant about preventing this from happening, we end up with scientism. I use the term scientism to denote a religious, a blind faith belief in whatever conclusions scientists declare as having been established or proven by their experiments or by their simulations or their modeling. It's a zealous belief that whatever science proclaims is unquestionable truth. Science can't give us truth. All science really can do is say, we have collected observations as data points, and we've analyzed and assessed these data, and we've interpreted them to the best of our knowledge. And these are the conclusions that we've drawn. And these conclusions are not truth. They're simply the best theories that we can put forth to explain a phenomenon that we've observed with our current understanding of the world, with our current knowledge, in our current paradigm of understanding. And that's very different from factual truth. Factual truth is proven. 2 + 2 = 4. It doesn't really matter if you get more information later on in human history. 2 + 2 will always be found to equal 4. But in science, the theories, the conclusions that are published are not factual truth. They're just the current explanations that we provide to explain phenomena to the best of our ability. That's all it is. So for thousands of years, doctors bled people who were sick as a cure, and because of the placebo effect, and because when people were bled, they were allowed to rest for several days, and they were preferentially fed. And if they were bled in the doctor's little clinic, they probably had access to cleaner water and simply the reduction of stress from not having to work, because life has been very hard for humans up until very recently. And so all of these other factors combined to produce a seeming result, a seemingly positive result from leading people to cure them of all kinds of illnesses. And so for thousands of years, it was scientific truth that the cure for epilepsy, the cure for mental illness, the cure for exhaustion, the cure for syphilis, all of these, I don't know about syphilis, all of these different illnesses were cured by slicing someone open and letting them bleed into a pot to bleed out the evil spirits that were causing the disease. And we're very arrogant in thinking that the conclusions that we're drawing from our science today are somehow intrinsically different and better. In some ways, yes, we've established a method that tries to control for the placebo effect, although that's questionable if you look at actual medical studies, and if you actually dig down and look at how they're done, sketchy bacon things going on there. But in a lot of different scientific approaches and endeavors, an attempt is being made to control for confounding factors. But the problem is that we often ignore the biases, the models, the underlying assumptions that we come to the table with when it comes time to interpret data. And all these different things strongly affect the conclusions that we draw. And if we're not more cautious about mistaking what science has proven for factual truth, then we fall into a hole wherein science loses its legitimacy, because we start to see science publishing contradictory factual truths from what they published 10 years ago. And so if you're mistaking what you're reading that's coming out of published science research as factual truth, and then you find that 5 or 10 years later, it's contradicting the factual truth that came before it, then people lose trust in the legitimacy of science and the power of science to contribute valuable information. And that is horrific, because our society, our advancement, our prosperity and the comfort and quality of our lives are so heavily dependent on how we do science, how we acquire knowledge, the processes that we put in place in order to filter between useful information and not useful information. And that's the difference. It's not about establishing the difference between what's true and what's false, because science doesn't give us truth. It gives us useful information versus information that's not as useful or not useful at all. Once upon a time, I used to know this biology teacher, and he used to tell the story I'm going to share with you now. Shout out Mr. Shocks. That's what he was called. Once upon a time, a couple of very important, very educated men, scientists in fact, decided to do science together. On a sunny afternoon, they had captured a grasshopper, and this became the object of their experiment. One of the scientists brought his trusty clipboard and his favorite pen to write down all the important data that they would collect through observation and testing. The other guy brought the grasshopper. They set the grasshopper under a glass box with holes in it for air to pass through and for sound to pass through as well. On the bottom of this glass box, they had placed a piece of paper that had been very carefully, very accurately measured and marked so that they could accurately, reliably, precisely measure the distance that the grasshopper would jump when prompted. Then, one of the scientists shouted, "Jump!" And the grasshopper jumped. And the other scientist wrote down very carefully, very accurate, the distance that the grasshopper had jumped and the reaction time, the time it took for the grasshopper to jump after the first scientist had given the instruction. Sometimes your master's degree supervisor will ask/demand that you do a log transformation on reaction times. This is usually done when she's under pressure to publish because she's going to a conference in China to present the results of her work, and she has no publishable results because there's actually no effect of her experiment. And so you do a log transformation, and what that does is it takes any kind of noise in the data, any kind of random blip, and it amplifies it because you're kind of compressing the data, and so any noise turns into what looks like an effect. And so by doing a log transformation of the data, you can effectively produce a statistically significant effect result that is then publishable. Also terribly unethical. And when you refuse to do it, you get in trouble. And then they send you to the department head because you're not being cooperative. And when you explain the situation, he says, quite angrily, everybody does this. And then you lose a lot of faith in all of science. But that's not what these scientists did in our little story here. They did not do any log transformation of the reaction times, and also they did not trim outliers either. And then the scientists grabbed the grasshopper out of the glass box, ripped off one of its legs, put him back in the box at the starting position, closed the box over him, and repeated the first test or trial. And so they put him back in the box without his one leg, and then the scientist said, jump. And the second scientist recorded the reaction time and the distance that the grasshopper had jumped. And then the scientist grabbed the grasshopper out of the box and ripped off one of his legs. And then they put him back in the box at the starting position. And then one of the scientists said, jump. And the second scientist carefully wrote down the reaction time between the giving of the prompt and the moment of the grasshopper jumping. And he also then recorded the distance of the jump. And then they lifted the grasshopper out of his box and ripped off his last leg. And then they put him back in the starting position, closed the box, and then one of the scientists said, jump, while the other scientist wrote down the reaction time and prepared himself to write down the distance the grasshopper had covered in his jump. Except this time, the grasshopper didn't jump. He just lay there, not responding to the command that he had been given. And so the very smart, very educated scientists, after carefully analyzing their collected data, concluded that clearly grasshoppers have their ears on their legs, and so when you tear off all their legs, they can no longer hear your instructions, and then they fail to carry out the desired action. #scientism. And that's how we know that grasshoppers have their ears on their legs. A further analysis of their data also provided extra support for their conclusion, because as the grasshopper's hearing suffered and was reduced by the removal of each subsequent leg, which was the removal of his ears or hearing devices, the grasshopper hesitated longer and longer between the command given and the actual jump. And the scientists were well rewarded for this amazing study by being given extra grant money the following year to look more deeply into whether or not, by dissecting the leg of a living grasshopper, they could figure out where the hearing cells were located on the leg of the grasshopper. And that, my friends, is how we know the grasshoppers have their ears on their legs. Subscribe to our channel, and we make a new video every Monday. My list was a lot less noticeable on Tuesdays. Subscribe to my channel. I share a new video every Tuesday, Monday, I voted for Tuesdays. Subscribe to my channel. I share a new video every Monday. Tuesdays.
Really?